Well, greetings, my friends. I hope you're all doing well. And happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers out there. Thank you for your service. It is appreciated. And so, today, I've been working out in my yard, working in my trees, working in my vegetables. It's one of my favorite things. But it also has me quite sweaty and quite dirty, and while I do not consider myself an overly vain man, I am apparently vain enough that I do not want to appear on camera. So I'm coming at you in all audio today, all audio. And also let me add, there are few things more magical in this life than walking outside early morning as the sun's coming up, birds are singing, world's coming alive. You walk out there in the morning dew and you pluck a peach off your own peach tree and you eat that peach out in your yard as the world wakes up around you. There are a few things more beautiful than that, and I am very grateful for it every morning. And those mornings are coming to an end because I've pretty much eaten all of the peaches off my trees. But anyway, so while I was out there working, I was listening to an audiobook titled Stalin's Secret Agents. Now, I'm not listening to this book in isolation. This is part of a line of inquiry that I have been delving into for several years now, which has led me to formulate a certain perception of history, secret history, hidden history, one could even say, and how it could be affecting the modern day. It could be. These are all these things I'm exploring, right? These are thoughts that I'm exploring. I'm not a fanatic. I'm not dogmatic. I'm not overzealous. I try not to be overzealous. But I do believe the evidence supports the hypothesis that I have. And as I was working out there, it occurred to me that I have not expressed this in relation to a previous video that I made in which I discussed how I'm going to be talking about Fred Crisman, murder of city Tacoma, and the events of the late 1960s in the city of Tacoma, Washington. I will pin that previous video in the description box below or adjacent to the recording that you're listening to. I don't know which platform you're going to be listening to this on, so it could be below, it could be adjacent. I don't know. But while I was out there working, I realized that I hadn't really fully expressed why I think those events potentially are much more significant than they appear. Now, let me quickly run down for the people who didn't watch that previous video. What I am referring to is the late 1960s in Tacoma, Washington. There was a fierce political battle. Even if you strip away all of the hidden, mysterious stuff that I'm trying to delve into, even if you just look at it from the normie perspective, just mainstream history perspective, it's still a fascinating event, and it's one that I would want to tell the story even without the other stuff. I just find it interesting. You don't see too many political battles that were that dogged and that antagonistic, and that ran the edge of actual physical violence so much. It was a dirty, dirty mudslinging time, man, and it's interesting, even just on its normie face. But to the deeper events, before I get into that. And so, you had this political battle, late 1960s, Tacoma, Washington. Into this scene appears a man named Fred Crisman. Now, Fred Crisman has been associated with so many bizarre things, it really boggles the imagination. He has been associated, he testified for the JFK assassination, Maury Island UFO incident, Danny Casolaro octopus stuff. I mean, just all over the place. Fred Crisman is a very intriguing guy. And to this day, despite many attempts to make sense of his life, a lot of people, I have talked to people who know his story well, who think he was a high-level government intelligence spook, and then I have talked to other people who are also well-read, well-researched, who think he was basically just a nutball who was making everything up. That's how much the man has managed to retain a mystery about his life. It's really pretty astounding. Because effort has been made to find out what this guy was about. And he just eludes. Nobody can really pin the guy down. However, I have my own ideas. And these ideas are informed. And so Fred Crisman inserted into the scene. And he led a propaganda battle against the existing power structure in Tacoma. He did this from a radio station, but he also had publications. He was mailing stuff out. But he was also just networking. He had a whole bunch of support. Virginia Shackelford is somebody who I'll be talking about. She was a big person on his side. And so Crisman comes in, launches this PR campaign, and successfully contributes to overturning the political order in the area. Now, this didn't last forever. The battle continued. It wasn't a black and white thing with a clear end, or clear beginning and a clear end. But Crisman's efforts were not by any means insignificant. He was significant at what he did, right? Now that's interesting, right? However, I think it's potentially much more interesting than that. Much more interesting than that. And why do I think that? I think that because of the audiobook that I was listening to, Stalin's Secret Agents, but like I said, that's only one of many books that I've been reading on this topic, as I've been piecing together what I think is kind of a hidden, occulted American history. Another book that I recommend to anyone out there, please buy this book. Blacklisted by History, The Untold Story of Senator Joe McCarthy and His Fight Against America's Enemies. That is by M. Stanton Evans. The book is amazing. It's a large book, and I've still read it twice. But in addition, then you have, to a somewhat lesser extent, not because it's a fantastic book, but I mean a lesser extent, because the conclusions aren't perfectly adjacent, but still, Chaos, Charles Manson, LSD, Charles Manson, The Secret History of the 60s, I believe is the full title, by Tom O'Neill, which just came out a few years ago. That's one of these books. There's a whole bunch of others. And I can lay out all of the details and evidence at another time. But right now I want to give the gist of my hypothesis for why I think the events of Fred Crisman and murder of a city, Tacoma, are potentially much more significant than they appear on their face. And in particular, with a group that named the Servants of Awareness, or the Organization of Awareness, which really will be the focus of my research, because the stuff I found about them, number one, hardly anybody I know has delved too deeply into them. But number two, really interesting and really weird stuff. But anyway, so now if you look back at the evidence, it appears that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched a ideological subversion campaign in the United States. Now, this manifested on its face, people talking about spies, like spies in the most basic sense. You know, somebody going into files, stealing files, sending the files back to the Soviet Union, right? But then there's another layer to it. Which is that there were high-ranking Soviet sympathizers who were influencing American policy, right? That's arguably more significant than stealing the secrets. And you can make an argument if it was like atomic bomb stuff or something like that. But generally, I would argue that the bigger threat was the influence on American policy. And that, too, is well documented. But I think there's an even deeper layer. And it's a layer that I think is even harder to document. And I want to be clear. I am not coming at these things I am coming at these things in an open mind. I'm looking at the evidence, and I want to see where the evidence leads. So while I have this hypothesis, I'm not completely married to this. However, it appears to me that there was a deeper level to the Soviet ideological subversion, and that was cultural subversion. That was the attempt to come in and basically make everybody, to make as many people as possible communist sympathizers, right? And I believe that this war, this secret war, secret information, secret influence, secret propaganda war, was waging just under the surface of American society for decades. I think one of it really kind of peaked in the 1960s. However, I believe it's possible, and again, possible. I am determined to keep logical and rational and look at the evidence, and not to get sucked into a paranoid rabbit hole. But I think it could be argued that the influence still exists to today. But anyway, so I believe that part of this ideological war, I don't believe that it was just the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. I think that there was a schism, a rift in U.S. intelligence, in that there were some Soviet sympathizers and that there were some of the pro-American intelligence forces, and that they were all engaged in a big ideological war, a cultural war, right? Shaping hearts and minds without the people being aware. Now, I find this fascinating, but I also, not to sound arrogant, but I think I am a good person to delve into this and talk about this. And the reason is because most other people I know that deal in this, what I consider alternative history, but other people call conspiracy theory, they'll all say, like, I'm a free thinker, but they're really not. The vast majority of people in this space, they are married to a certain ideological perspective, and when they look at these kinds of this kind of secret knowledge, they only look at it from the frame of the side that they are sympathetic to. Sometimes I think this is intended. A lot of times I think people are just shills, right? But a lot of times I don't think it's intended. I think people are just so obsessed with their own ideological perspective that they can't see the other side. And the reason why I say that is I believe that these games are being played on all sides at all time by various parties, including parties that I might support, right? Like I'm not a child, man. I don't like sit here thinking, the people whose ideology I agree with, they would never do these kind of games. We were born into this chessboard, man. We were born onto this chessboard. We're playing a game that God set out before us. And when you are involved in certain aspects of this game, there's no way to play it without getting a little bit dirty. That's just the way it is. And so I do not look at it, because what ends up happening in these circles is you have people and they will obsessively fixate on one side of something. And you hear this all the time. They control everything, like they with the capital T. They control everything as though there's this one monolithic force controlling everything. Now, the insanity of having that worldview is that it can never be disproven. Because no matter what happens, you can just say, well, there it is again. That's the secret puppet masters. This must be what they want to happen. And so therefore, it must feed into whatever their next plan is. And that's why these people end up, they're always just full of despair and negativity and cynicism and sarcasm and nothing beautiful or inspiring to reach towards, right? They get stuck in the muck. And I say that with some sympathy because I've gotten stuck there a couple times in my life. So I say that with some sympathy. However, I don't think it's accurate. It's not healthy. It's not emotionally or mentally healthy. But really, more importantly, I don't think it's accurate. The way that I perceive events is that there are many groups, all who have this knowledge for how to manipulate culture and how to bend people's perceptions in a certain direction, how to use information to, mind control, brainwash. I think those words are a little too excessive. I think it's more subtle than that. But for all intents and purposes, yeah, that's basically what's going on. I think there are many groups that know how to do these things. Right now, I think it's clear that there's a group with one particular ideological perception that seems to be winning all of this. But that does not mean that I think it's one monolithic force in action at all times. I don't believe that at all. I think there's multiple factions. And new forces arising every day, forces going away. It's just, you get to a certain level and you are exposed to a certain level of information and shown how to influence culture and how to influence society. And so then you go do it. And it's all these groups competing with each other to try to bend the hearts and minds in the direction that they want. That's how I perceive it. And what I think may have happened in the murder of a city Tacoma events, I think it's possible that Fred Crisman was one of the agents that was one of these figures that was locked into this ideological manipulation campaign. We'll call it persuasion campaign, right? But this is stuff that's happening at a very subtle level, which we'll get into later. But one of the problems that arises when you try to talk to people about these topics is that they think of propaganda as being like, like a poster that says, all people of X type are evil and should be destroyed. That's not useful propaganda. That stuff. I mean, the only real function of that kind of propaganda is to fire up the people who already agree with you. But you're not going to convince anybody with any of that stuff, and that's not how any of this works. The science of persuasion and manipulation was far more complicated than that decades ago. Just read the books, man. Read the books. People have known how to manipulate and have openly written playbooks on how to manipulate for a long frickin' time. And if you don't think that's because you're not paying attention, and it's probably because you've had some stuff fed into your mind that is keeping you from looking at reality in just a common sense common sense fashion. But anyway. And so I believe that Crisman was on the I see. I should have thought these terms through more, but what could be called the pro-American side, and I only say that with some reservations because this stuff is sticky, man. It's sticky, but we'll say in Crisman's time, right? And he talks about this in Murder of a City, Tacoma. I will point out things where he discusses all of these little things that were happening in society, American society at the time. Crisman perceived them as being attempts to subvert American society and to bring in a communist ideology. And, of course, the modern times being what they are, I've had people laugh at Crisman and be like, oh yeah, haha, human resources departments, that's a commie scam, haha, you paranoid nut job. And again, most of the people in this sphere, this alternative history sphere, what some might call a conspiracy theorist sphere, they're no different from anyone else, man. Like, in the sense that they want their side to be right, and they're going to poo-poo anything that says that their side is equally culpable or even more culpable in deception and manipulation. And that's why I don't really talk to people. I used to mix it up with people in the sphere, but no more. I don't want anything to do with them, man. They're mostly very unhealthy, really kind of sick people. But even when they're not unhealthy and sick, they're just as overly partisan as anybody else in American society. They like to think of themselves as free thinkers, but they rarely are in my experience. But anyway, and so I believe that Crisman was on the pro-American side, and that the events of the Tacoma, this is not because Tacoma was by no means the most important city in America, but I think this stuff was happening all over America, but just in Tacoma we have a really good case study of it. This attempt to subvert American ideals of capitalism and democracy, and to subvert it with Soviet ideals and or communist ideals. And I believe that this was happening. Well, we know that this was happening in the Cold War. The question is how extensive it was, but we know it was happening. And so the reason why I think those events were so significant is because I think we have what has hitherto been unexplored, a perfect little microcosmic snapshot of what was happening on a national and probably a global stage, as these forces were competing with each other to influence the hearts and minds and steer society in the direction that they wanted to steer it. I think Crisman was one of the soldiers involved in this battle. And I believe that he was tied into a larger network. He was not operating simply as, like in the book, he basically paints himself as just a good Samaritan who stumbled into a bad situation and just had to do something. And, he's associated with Rasmussen, or I think his name is Rasmussen. I don't have the book on hand. Riconsueto, however you say that name. But anyway, so we know that he was acting at the behest of some of the political power players at that time, but I think it went deeper than that. I think it went deeper than just those political players. I think Crisman was involved in this, like I said, this basically secret war that was being waged around the United States. This was happening in the late 1960s, and that was really what appears to have been the peak of this battle, and we are still dealing with the aftermath of it today. I believe earlier I mentioned that I think it's possible that these Soviet communist sympathizing forces that they continue to exert influence in our political system today. I believe that is a possibility. But even if they didn't, the repercussions of those times continue to play out. And again, it's in very subtle ways. We're talking about cultural, ideological, psychological influence, persuasion, and subversion. These are very subtle things, which is why it's really more nefarious and harder to pin down and really harder to figure out, but also just so fascinating. Isn't it just so fascinating, man, how you can have, people can go into a society. There was this book I was reading, and I cannot remember the title of it. I will be digging all this stuff up for future videos, but it was talking about World War II. It was one of Soviet, Stalin's, chief propagandist. Really interesting guy. But he used newspapers to influence. And this was even way back then, man. That's what I say. People when they hear about, if they're even willing to go with the idea that there are forces out there trying to control your way of thinking, right? If people can even accept that, they often leap to this really cartoonish kind of idea that it's, like I said, these really overly obvious, like somebody standing up on a podium shaking their fist and yelling or whatever. No, man, this stuff, the science of manipulation, the science of deception and persuasion has been much more subtle than that for a long time. But like even back in World War II, Stalin's chief propagandist, he in other countries, he would have in enemy nations, they would have printing presses set up, and on their face they would appear to be just, say, a newspaper, right? And 95% of their content would actually be just regular news. But it was that 5%. It was that 5% of sneaky stuff that they would stick in there, right? Like subtle, very subtle little changes of angles on things, changing the lighting on things just a little bit, to get people to look at reality a little bit more like you want them to. You don't hit them over the head with it. If you hit them over the head with it, it's completely ineffective. It's a constant tapping on the shoulder. It's a nudging, right? It's much more subtle than that. And it's an interesting thing because Crisman's approach was not subtle at all. You can look at the stuff that Crisman was saying back then, and it was very obvious pro-American propaganda, pro-American persuasion techniques. However, maybe that's just because it made sense, because he was preaching to the choir, right? Like I would think if he was there and if he was competing with these ideologically subversive forces, because of the nature of his position, he wouldn't be so much trying to turn minds into a new direction. He would be trying to ramp up the emotions, dedication, patriotism, and force, just the general emotional force. Because he was speaking to, at that time in the late 1960s, Americans were still American. Like nowadays it's a very different landscape because you have socialist sympathizing people all over the place. It wasn't that way back then, right? So he was preaching to the choir. And so maybe when you enter into these kind of propaganda wars, if it was a propaganda war, we know it was a propaganda war, if it was one of these deeper levels of subversive campaigns, maybe when you are speaking to the native population, you are more geared towards ramping up existing deep national feelings as opposed to the more subtle work that would be done on the other end. And that does seem to make sense, right? Just from a strategic, tactical perspective, that would seem to make sense to me. I don't know. Who really knows? That's what we're going to be delving into. Although, yeah, whatever. I'll get in. I've been rambling on for too long. But anyway, that is why I think that the story may be much more fascinating than it appears, and why it may be much more significant than it appears. Especially, I want to say the stuff about Crisman, that, like, there's some interesting things that I uncovered, but it's really about this group, the Organization of Awareness and the Servants of Awareness. This is the far out stuff. Very interesting, very intriguing. Very intriguing implications, but also just the Pacific Northwest in that era, and that late 1960s era, most of the history, it's centered in New York, which, I always think of it as being encapsulated by Andy Warhol, the Velvet Underground, that whole group, but then also, of course, California dreaming, California, man. That whole Southern California area where the hippie thing exploded from. Yeah, sorry. Anyway, I've kind of lost my train of thought. I've said what I needed to say. And so people have talked about those areas, but the Pacific Northwest doesn't get talked about that often, which is really interesting to me because I lived in the Pacific Northwest for I think about 15 years, and I can tell you, man, that you want to talk about a very socialist sympathizing area. That the Pacific Northwest, man, is a very socialist sympathizing area, and and so that era, the history from that time doesn't get talked about that often. But the stuff that I dug up with the Organization of Awareness and the Servants of Awareness stuff, there was a whole interesting, fascinating, bizarre network operating up there, And I believe it's possible, again, possible, that it's tied into this larger scenario that I'm talking about. So anyway, I think I got my point across well. And that's why I think the story is interesting. That's why I think it will be worthwhile everybody following it. And I'm really looking forward to getting back into exploring this, man. I learned from my mistakes last time. I learned how to keep myself from going too deep into the rabbit hole and in an unhealthy way. And so this is going to be fun. I'm determined for this to be fun and fascinating and interesting. And I look forward to sharing it with all of you. So again, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. And just a great day to everyone else. Hope you're all doing well. Peace out.